During World War I, the British and French agreed that as a reward for the Jews who fought with the Allies in the Middle East and Mesopotamia theater of operations, they would be given their ancestral homeland, a place called Palestine carved out from the old Ottoman Empire. This agreement was concluded with the Balfour Declaration, made on November 2, 1917, stating British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for Jewish people. The British government hoped that the declaration would rally Jewish opinion, especially in the United States, to join the Allied powers against the Central Powers during World War I. They hoped also that the settlement in Palestine of a pro-British Jewish population might help protect the approaches to the Suez Canal in neighboring Egypt and thus ensure a vital communication route to British colonial possessions in India and Southeast Asia. The promises in the Balfour Declaration were confirmed in a letter from the British Foreign Secretary Arthur John Balfour to Baron Lionel Walter Rothschild, leader of the Anglo-Jewish community, who was later included in the British mandate over Palestine. But local Muslims were a little upset about this. The British, in their defense to not honor the declaration, cited the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the secret agreement between Britain and France concluded the year before in 1916 by Sir Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot, which essentially divided up the Middle East under their respective empires. The secret Sykes-Picot Agreement contradicted the terms of the Balfour Declaration. The Jews, in fact, the world's governments, supported the efforts of a Jewish state, as Jews had been living there for 5,000 years, and more had been arriving in the early 19th century. The Ottomans, in fact, allowed this immigration of Jews, much to the detriment of the Arabs, whom they persecuted. See our video on Israel versus Palestine. After the war, the agreement was dismissed due to the concerns of Muslims rising up against the British occupation forces in their new mandates of Transjordan to include Palestine. Then after World War II, those concerns grew in scope. Therefore, on July 22, 1946, Jewish freedom fighters, or terrorists, depending upon one's position, blew up the King David Hotel in an act of militant defiance of British rule. This event was the result of decades of frustration at not having their own Jewish state, as promised. The background leading up to this event and the broader conflict that followed is critical to understanding how and why it occurred. What was the King David Hotel? Why was it bombed? Who occupied it? Why were they there? What was the result of the action? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. The King David Hotel was the location of both the British Military Command and the British Criminal Investigation Division. The enforcement of the strict immigration and taxation laws targeting Jews had hindered saving many Jews from death during the war, and even saving thousands from starvation and persecution after the war was halted when they were strapped and trapped in Soviet-held Eastern Europe. The world was appalled after the Holocaust was exposed, which was the primary reason for the Nuremberg and subsequent war crimes trials. Ever since the end of World War I, the British policy was to restrict Jewish immigration to only 2,500 people per year, most coming from Europe. And this had been the law for decades. Jews who entered illegally were arrested, imprisoned, and most were deported, even during World War II. Ships had been refused the right to dock with Jews fleeing the Holocaust and turned back, forcing them to return to German-occupied Europe, condemning their human cargo to certain death. This happened continuously even after the Holocaust became known to the world after 1943. Underground Jewish groups did manage to smuggle Jews into Palestine via Syria and Persia, most of those escaping from the Soviet Union. The British, afraid of upsetting the Arab-Muslim majority and causing an uprising, were ruthless in their application of the law at the expense of the Jews. The Jewish Council, which operated under the mandate, also denounced the long-standing and increasing tax laws that targeted Jews more than anyone else, mainly because Jews started businesses and were successful at agriculture. Increasing the tension was the knowledge that, when the war in Europe was nearly over, the existence of the death camps, which had been liberated, was well known. The Jewish Agency for Immigration used this information to petition the British as early as 1942 to allow Jews, especially those Polish Jews released from Siberia, under the agreement that Winston Churchill made with Joseph Stalin to assist the Allied war effort. Many of the Poles who were released from the gulags formed the Free Polish Army, often called the Anders Army, and were Jewish and Catholic. They volunteered to fight with the British, but their relatives wanted to go to Palestine. Many were kept in Persia, later named Iran, and their ancestors remain there today. The Jewish Agency had been collecting information on surviving Jews liberated from the camps and connecting them with relatives living in Palestine. The agency petitioned to reunite family members, and those requests were consistently denied. Knowing that the Jewish Agency and Council had a legitimate concern in their petitions with regard to reuniting families, especially with the creation of the United Nations and with what had transpired during the Yalta Conference, the British wanted to confiscate these records, and they raided the Jewish Agency on June 29, 1946, and confiscated large quantities of documents and files and placed over 2,500 Jews from all over Palestine accused of illegal entry under arrest. By this time, the Irgun, or General Command Authority, had seen enough. The information the British had confiscated about Jewish agency operations, list of names of known survivors, including Jewish intelligence activities in Arab countries, was taken to the King David Hotel, and the Jewish Agency wanted it all back. A week later, it was learned that 40 Jews who had been denied immigration, some being Poles who returned home after fighting in the Free Polish Army, were murdered by the communists in Kielce, Poland. Britain's highly restrictive immigration policy to appease the Muslim majority in violation of the Balfour Declaration of 1917 had condemned thousands to death. Many of the dead had relatives in Palestine, and those names were in the agency's documents, which would have been very bad public relations back home in Britain for the British occupation forces, and also a violation of the post-war agreements on the Jewish diaspora. The outrage was felt throughout the Jewish community, and they demanded that some action be taken, and they wanted revenge. The Irgun then decided to take direct, covert military action against the hotel, get the stolen records, and make a statement by bombing the building. They expected military casualties, and that was the plan, and the new Irgun leader, the future Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, wanted to avoid civilian casualties in any operation, even among Muslims. The Jewish fighters managed to enter the hotel, many disguised as British soldiers, some as Arabs, some as workers, placing explosives. Once all was in place, 3 telephone calls were placed to the hotel, another call made to the French consulate, and a third call to the Palestine Post, all warning that explosives in the King David Hotel would soon be detonated. One operative named Adina Hai-nisan said that she called the hotel switchboard 30 minutes prior to the explosion, which was answered but then ignored. The Irgun carried out a diversionary first bombing after the bombs were planted in the King David Hotel. This first diversionary bomb was placed in a wagon outside shops next to the hotel. This first bomb was detonated, which broke several windows but caused no injuries and may have been intended to cause panic and encourage evacuation of the building. Whether through hubris or believing the calls were pranks, the hotel was not evacuated. Begin himself quotes one British official who supposedly refused to evacuate the building by saying, "We don't take orders from the Jews." That was a mistake because at 12:30 p.m. the massive explosion blew through much of the hotel's south side, killing 91 people and injuring 45 more. In the aftermath, 6 survivors were discovered buried alive over the next several days under the rubble in the part that collapsed by soldiers of the 9th Airborne Squadron Royal Engineers. Among those casualties were 15 Jews. For many years afterward, the British denied that they had been warned in advance, but in 1979, a member of the British Parliament, Lord Greville Jenner, produced direct evidence that the Irgun had indeed issued the warning supporting Begin's statement. He offered the testimony of a British officer who heard other officers in the King David Hotel bar joking about a Zionist threat to the headquarters. The officer who overheard the conversation immediately left the hotel and survived. Also, according to Lord Greville Jenner, Brigadier General Dudley Sheridan Skelton was head of a hospital near Jerusalem and a frequent visitor to the King David Hotel. He was there on the day of the explosion and wrote a letter to a colleague in which he said a warning was passed on to the officers in the bar in rather jocular terms, implying it was a Jewish terrorist bluff. But despite advice to ignore the bluff, he decided to leave and thus was out of the hotel when the explosion took place. Citing Eldad Haruvi's book, Palestine Investigated, the Criminal Investigation Department of the Palestine Police Force, 1920 to 1948, the Israel State Archives noted the British CID had intelligence showing the hotel as a possible target for attack by the Irgun in December 1945, 6 months prior to the attack. The CID asked to raise security in the hotel, including putting armed soldiers at the Regent's restaurant at the entrance of the hotel. The Chief Secretary, Sir John Shaw, refused to consider these suggestions, with the justification being that there were not many places for recreation and fun in Palestine, and he did not want to foreclose another location. He continued to refuse to act or even to pass on the information to the High Commissioner of Palestine when the CID approached him again with newer information on the attack plan, as the CID had the plan of attack but did not know exactly when it would be carried out or what the exact targets were. Shaw was blamed by one former CID officer interviewed by Haruvi for the failure to evacuate the building. Reportedly, after the Irgun called in their warning, Shaw said, "I'm not here to take orders from the Jews, I'm here to give them." This was who Begin cited in his book, The Revolt, and therefore justifies his writings. The King David Hotel bombing forced the British to reevaluate their policies, but rather than work with the Jews in the region and relax the strict immigration policies, they became even more heavy-handed, only increasing the animosity among the people they controlled. After the bombing, the British police and military began a roundup of all suspected terrorists. They also maintained the decades-long ban on the Jewish religious practices on their holiest of days, such as Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, and worshiping at the Western Wall because it offended Muslims. These events would explode again in a new wave of attacks as the Jews increased the momentum of their resistance, but nothing was as spectacular as the King David Hotel bombing, which we will cover in another video soon. The public outrage expected against the Jews who were using guerrilla warfare against the British did not really materialize. In fact, Britain was blamed for not honoring their previous agreements. Once the United Nations established the State of Israel in 1948, Britain no longer had the authority to impose their laws and restrict Jewish freedoms. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.